King Edward VI does not enjoy a good reputation in our time. Historian Tracy Borman attests to him the making of a monster. Terms such as tiny tyrant also appear frequently to describe him. Naive, spoiled, and taken with witchcraft are other unflattering descriptions that are given to him. But are these accusations true? As a spoiler, they are mostly false, and in my opinion, they are projections. But I won't get to that until the end of the video, as it's just my personal view of things. First, we should look at the allegations in detail. Borman is a historian for whom I enjoy only the greatest esteem. My following remarks should therefore in no way be interpreted as doubts about her work. I just don't agree with her conclusions. This is part of the historical process of cognition. Borman speculates that Edward's reign could have been as terrible as his father's if he hadn't died at the age of 15. She writes, for example, if he had lived to maturity, there is little doubt that Edward would have persecuted any nonconformists with increasing severity, even more so, perhaps, than his elder half-sister later did. One approach is his diary, which shows him as cold, callous, and unwilling to compromise. Texts with a touch of polemism say that he had no emotions at all. A prime example of this is often the entry about the execution of his uncle and the former Lord Protector, Edward Seymour. The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. The next accusation concerns Edward's tantrums and a falcon. At the age of 12 or 13, he is said to have torn such a bird into 4 parts in his chambers and threatened his servants. The entire process is hearsay, based on a letter from the imperial ambassador to the emperor. The letter is dated March 21st, 1551. The text reads, "Incidentally, I will add the account of an act which is said to have been committed by the King of England. He is said to have plucked a falcon, which he kept in his private chamber, and torn it into 4 pieces, saying as he did so to his governors that he likened himself to the falcon, whom everyone plucked, but that he would pluck them too thereafter, and tear them in 4 parts. I have heard the truth of the story certified by people whose testimony should place it beyond doubt." But nevertheless, Ambassador Mason denies it and accuses President Monluc of having excogitated it entirely himself. Edward's relationship with his eldest half-sister Mary is also often cited. The 2 siblings did not agree on religious issues. As part of a Christmas celebration at court, they engaged in such a loud screaming match that many of the visitors could hear it. Edward is said to have yelled the following, "Truly, sister, I will see my laws strictly obeyed, and those who break them shall be watched and denounced." Mary later replied to the question of whether she wanted to obey her brother that she would not do so, because, quote, "In these years, although he, good sweet king, have more knowledge than any other of his years, yet it is not possible that he can be a judge in these things." This was a clear difference from earlier days. Edward, for example, used to write to her, "I love you most," or that he was particularly fond of her. People who bring charges like that Edward was too spoiled attribute this to the fact that he had gold-finished textbooks, clean apartments, high security, and the best toys. Henry VIII, quote, is also sometimes cited that Edward is this whole realm's most precious jewel. What the accusation of naivety is supposed to be particularly based on, apart from his young age, I do not know. I will only mention the following episode. On January 16th, 1549, Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, armed with a pistol, broke into the royal apartments to kidnap the young monarch. In the process, he shot Edward's dog. He was subsequently executed for this. This is the kind of trauma that makes a person mature quickly. The Italian physician and astrologer Hieronymus Cardano fittingly wrote about Edward. The king carried himself like an old man. In the face of the sources, however, these accusations do not hold up. Let's start with the lack of emotion. Cardano also wrote that Edward is always affable and gentle. Edward had an almost paternal relationship with Canterbury's Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. For example, he wrote to the cleric, "I affectionately receive and honor that truly paternal affection which you have expressed, and I hope that you may live many years and continue to be my honored father by your godly and wholesome advice." The fact that his diary did not reflect his emotions was intentional. He was asked by his teachers, Richard Cox and John Check, to record objectively what he felt was important, especially for Edward Seymour. There is also the fact that the then Lord Protector had effectively kidnapped him in a nightie and fog operation and brought him to Windsor Castle to remain in power. This was about 9 months after his other uncle broke into his bedroom with a gun in his hand. What emotional reaction should he show as a 12-year-old? The list of evidence that he was able to show emotions could also be continued considerably. For example, he cried with his sister Elizabeth when he learned of his father's death. Edward came strongly after his grandfather Henry VII. He was extremely intelligent, but didn't like to show his emotions to the outside world. His teachers judged that Edward has accomplished at this early period of his life more numerous and important objects than others have been able to do when their age was more settled and matured. Borman also admits that this was no exaggeration. She writes, "This was no flattery. Edward was a precocious student who applied himself with a discipline beyond his years." Edward's siblings received a similarly good education as the young king. Henry had attached the greatest importance to this. As long as he acknowledged his daughters, he also used similarly flattering descriptions for them as he did for Edward. Mary, for example, was his pearl. Edward also always acted as a protector of his sister Mary. We know this from her herself. She was not only allowed to continue to attend Catholic Mass after a long dispute. In the spring of 1550, Mary toyed with the idea of fleeing for religious reasons. She explained at the time, "If my brother were to die, I would be far better out of the kingdom, because as soon as he were dead, before the people knew it, they would dispatch me too." Screaming matches between the siblings could also end like this. Mary stated, "When I perceive how the king, whom I love and honor above all other beings, as by nature and duty bound, had been counseled against me, I could not contain myself and exhibited my interior grief." She began to cry. Edward also began to cry and said, "He thought no harm of her." As a comparison, Henry forced Mary to recognize him as the head of the church. Otherwise, she was threatened with execution. Mary herself burned Cranmer, although he had publicly returned to Catholicism. She had her sister Elizabeth locked up in the Tower. Edward did nothing of the sort to his siblings, although his counsel would have been only too happy to do so, as Mary's quote makes clear. By the way, the story with the falcon is not only doubtful because it is hearsay. Exactly the same accusation was made against Emperor Charles V 37 years earlier. Charles was 14 years old at the time, and Renard was not even in England when this is said to have happened. He was on the mainland in Blois. This does not mean that it cannot have happened, but doubts are allowed. Apart from the fact that Tudor outbursts of rage did not necessarily lead to tyrannical rule, no one is a better example of this than Elizabeth, who became famous for her outbursts of anger. For example, John Guy writes, She was vain and courted flattery. She was jealous of her younger maids' youth and beauty. She had a vicious temper, attacking one of them with her fists and breaking the girl's finger, and she could swear volubly. Only the foolhardy approached her if she was in a foul mood. The polemical accusations that Edward was too spoiled crossed the line into ridiculousness in several places. The fact that the crown prince and then the king lives in a clean apartment and is protected in the best possible way is not particularly surprising. The fact that a 9-year-old gets a new crown because the actual one is too heavy is also not a sign of pampering. The English lily crown, for example, weighs 2.25 kilograms. The imperial state crown, which is currently worn, weighs more than 1 kilogram. The king must therefore hold up documents while reading because they would slip off his head when looking down. Even in Edward's time, the duration of the coronation ceremony was several hours and consisted of 10 elements. In addition, there were several days of celebrations. The 9-year-old was crowned just 3 weeks after his father's death, 3 weeks after he became an orphan. The idea that the entire process was shortened in time because he was too spoiled to go through it completely is abstruse. So why does Edward have such a bad reputation, even though it doesn't seem justified? And even though critics concede to him that he was able to appease his father when he had another tantrum, and although many of the accusations can also be directed against his half-sisters, there are 2 theses for this. The first is by Linda Porter, who wrote The Myth of Bloody Mary. Here she states, Edward moved much faster and much further than the majority of the population wanted, removing a great deal that was familiar and depriving the congregation of what many of them saw as the mystery and beauty of the experience of worship. The young king misunderstood or ignored the religious preferences of his people, and therefore a negative image of him took hold. Secondly, and this assumption comes directly from me and should only serve as food for thought, Edward becomes a victim of the contempt that is actually directed against his father. Henry desperately wanted a son. He treated his daughters very badly because of this. One of them became one of the greatest rulers in English history. Edward becomes a victim of anger at his father because he was the child Henry wanted. As an example, Edward tried to change the succession to the throne on his deathbed. His 2 sisters were not to get the crown, but instead Lady Jane Grey. Those who don't agree with Edward interpret the whole process as follows. Edward did everything in his power to rip his sisters' birthright away from them. It was not the birthright of his sisters, it was a legal regulation, the 3rd Act of Succession, which provided a spot in the line of the succession for his sisters. Those who speak of birthright assume that they had this because they were Henry's daughters and should therefore never have been removed from the succession to the throne. The accusation that Edward would deprive her of her birthright is actually directed against Henry, but again, it's just meant to be food for thought. As always, thank you for watching, and also, as always, please like and subscribe